I work at the Soil Plant Test Center in Nashville. I get a lot of calls from your customers, and not all of them are happy. Most of them are, but some of them question what you do, what you're doing. They see you with a bag of material, and they wonder if what you're doing is correct or if it's exactly what you're saying you're doing. And most of the time, what I tell them, I said, the number one thing is, does your company pull a soil sample? And if they don't, I said, well, you need to encourage them to do that, because how do they know what your fertility is? How do they know what your soil fertility is? And they stop and think about that now. I don't know. I guess they know somehow. And I'll tell you too, a lot of folks nowadays are very educated by the internet. Now you know and I know there's a lot of snake oil out there, right? Well, a lot of these companies that say and print these things that our customers are reading on the internet are very persuasive. And whether or not they're true or effective or anything like that, our customers, the people you and I deal with and talk to on a daily basis, that's where a lot of them get their information. Now, I try to encourage them to go to the university, whether it's the University of Tennessee. I have people who say, well, I don't like UT, I like Alabama. We'll go to the University of Alabama. They do the same sort of research we do.
You've got to go to Auburn.
Auburn, that's exactly right. You have to go to Auburn. The key is that it should be University of Research, because we've spent hours and hours and hours, as Frank says, the research, the students and so forth, who do that, the graduate students. And so that information has been tested and it's been proven, whether it works or not. So the first thing I tell a person who comes in and wants, they'll say, well, can you recommend someone? No, I'm not going to recommend anyone, but I would strongly encourage to ask them if they soil test. Now, have you ever tried to change a spark plug without a spark plug wrench? It's kind of hard, isn't it? It's almost impossible. And the same goes with soil testing. Get a probe. Now, this is a bottom of the line El Cheapo, but I pulled about 40 cores with it over the weekend. It works. It's a whole lot more fun than using a shovel or a core or a spade, and you get the job done a lot quicker and a lot more effective. If you don't have a soil probe in your truck, you need one. You got to have one. I keep this one in my car. I know that's kind of geeky, but I do. Because you never know in my field whether you need a soil probe. It's going to hurt your feelings. Just this El Cheapo is about 50 bucks. If you're in the business, you need to get you one of those high dollar types. It's about $120. They have a step on them. I have one with a step in my office, but I don't use it much because the step is too high for my short self. So, but most of you folks, the step one gives you a little bit more power going into the ground. Soil test, okay? Get you a probe. Okay, enough about that. Let's talk about how it can benefit you. How many soil tests? I'm going to put you on, oh, I love it. I'm preaching to the choir. That's great. Soil testing is by far the best tool you can do as a manager. And I'll tell this to cattle producers too. If you've got broom sage in your field, do you think you need lime? Not necessarily. The only way you know for sure is with the soil test. And so let's talk about these things. When we're looking at a turf grass situation, as you guys have heard everybody talk this morning, there are all kinds of things you have to look about and think about. Over here, I realize mostly everything is Bermuda grass, but in Middle and East Tennessee, we have both flavors of grasses. And I got a recommendation the other day for somebody wanting to establish St. Augustine grass. It is in Middle Tennessee. We've had it identified, and it's growing real well. So the first key is when you're growing things, you need to know what species you're dealing with, right? Also, you have to look at soil fertility. And I'm talking about these things because when we have problems, a lot of times we don't stop and think about these things until we have a problem. So if we're start, maybe we won't run into these. Shallow soil, we have to look at the physical factors. Shade, we have to look at that. Not all species of grasses grow good under a tree. Slope, soil structure. Compaction is one of those things, I think it's a problem. It's hard to determine in a lot of cases. But where we see, for example, algae growing on top of the ground, in a lot of cases that's compaction problem, where folks have gone over the same ground over and over and over for years and years. And then root competition. One of the questions I get quite a bit from homeowners that call that say, you know, I've got this lawn and this company has come out, they seed every year, and it still keeps dying out. Well, the first question I ask is, how many trees do you have in your yard? So you have to think about shade, and then you also have to think about root competition. If you've got a lot of trees, those plants aren't going to grow very well. But if you talk about other things, we're talking about soil analysis. In my opinion, in every aspect of agronomy, whether it's turf managers, whether it's hay producers, whether it's somebody with emus, you got to think about soil fertility, because in the end, we're all grass farmers, right? We have to take care of the ground. We have to know what that plant needs. And soil pH is one of those things, and we'll go into more specifics here. As far as the basic soil tests, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium, we have other secondary nutrients like sulfur, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. Micronutrients is one where there's a lot of snake oil out there, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. And then physical attributes of the soil. And what I mean by that, one of the things that a lot of contractors are needing, if you guys put in new landscapes, is sand, silt, clay analysis, some organic matter, physical attributes, that sort of thing. So if you look at the benefits of soil analysis, that is the only way you can determine pH. Now I've had people say, well, if so-and-so is growing there, then that means it's a low pH or it's a high pH. Plants, as you heard on one of the earlier talks about herbicides, they're adaptive, aren't they? They can change over time. So plants can grow in different various pHs, so that's not a very good tool. It's cost efficient. And the reason I mean cost efficient, if you pay for starter fertilizer that's got 46% phosphate in it and you don't need phosphorus, you think that's cost efficient? It's not. So soil test, that'll help you decide whether you need to do that or not. It's environmentally sound. I've had conversations in the past 5 or 6 years with people from the Department of Agriculture and others about runoff from lawns, gardens, farms, pasture land, that sort of thing. And it's probably going to get to a point in time, if not now, but sooner rather than later, that we're going to have to be accountable for the materials that we apply, and that's fertilizers. And we're going to have to take a closer look at soil analysis and what we're dealing with before we apply further nutrients. It's the only method to determine those needs. Like I said, soil testing and a happy, satisfied customer. You wouldn't believe the comments I get from homeowners who say their lawn care professional soil test. They like that. And I'm going to tell you, it makes you look like a big dog when you walk out there with the soil test probe, because that makes them feel like they're spending their money good. It's a good investment. So let's talk about soil pH. What's the big deal about that? Well, it determines whether or not we need lime. We know that, okay? It measures the acidity of the soil. There's a lot of guys in the industry that don't know what lime does and don't know what sulfur does. I've talked to several where we've had these discussions. Increased acidity reduces availability of nutrients. So, if you have a low pH, what's it going to do? A low pH and you fertilize, do you think that's an efficient use of the fertilizer? It isn't. Because chemically in the soil, it's going to prevent those nutrients from being taken up by the plant. Alkaline soils may induce toxicities. And the truth is, once you get up above 7 or 7.5 pH, those nutrients become copious. In other words, they become soluble, a slurry, so to speak, in the soil, and the plants are like, golly, it's like you drinking a 12-pack of beer in 1 hour or something. Your body cannot take all that alcohol. I know some that probably could, but I mean, it's the same thing. Those plants just cannot take up any more without it making them sick. 6.5 is the target pH for most plants. 5.5 for acid-loving shrubs like azaleas, rhododendrons, blueberries. If some people have blueberries in the landscape, that's another thing. Here's the important thing. Each pH unit is 10 times the change in pH. So if you have a 6.0 and a 5.0, 5.0 is 100 times more acidic than that 6.0 pH. So there's a huge difference, exponential difference in pH as it lowers. So this is the reason. Y'all probably seen this chart before, but this is why we're interested in pH. At a 6.5, which is our target pH, all the nutrients, the primary, secondary, and micronutrients are mostly available at that pH, okay? Now nitrogen, we won't spend a whole lot of time on nitrogen, but nitrogen is one of those that has to go through nitrification, several processes to become available or converted to the nitrate and ammonia form of nitrogen. Those processes work best at a 6.5 slightly acidic pH. Now there's one element that's not on here, and it's aluminum. Now I had Dr. Don Tyler tell me one time, said, you know, we lime to raise the pH, but we also lime to get away from aluminum. Aluminum becomes soluble way down here in these extreme pHs. We have some aluminum in our soils in Tennessee. If you get down that acidic, that aluminum becomes soluble in the soil, and it can kill a plant, lickety-split, because it's toxic. But if you look at acid-loving shrubs that like a 5.5, look what becomes more available, iron. You know, a lot of us a lot of folks have applied iron on green lawns. I've seen products out there sold to green up lawns with iron. I'm not sure that I completely agree with that. Most of our soils are pretty good in iron. I think a lot of times you could be dealing with a sulfur or nitrogen deficiency or a pH problem in that case. So I would look at those tools before I would apply additional or spend the money to apply that additional iron. Phosphorus, potassium, all those other ones are best available there. So nitrogen promotes that rapid green growth. We put down a half a pound of nitrogen and bam, things green up. It's nice and great. One thing about soil analysis and nitrogen I want to bring up. Nitrogen is what I call a volatile element, just like sulfur is. Okay? And the reason I say that, nitrogen comes in many different forms. It comes from nitrite, it comes nitrate, ammonia, ammonium, it comes as a gas, it comes as a liquid, it leaches, it volatilizes, it moves here, it moves there, it's all over the place. How in the thunder can you analyze that in a lab and be good at it? Now, we can test total nitrogen, we can test for ammonia, we can test for nitrate, and a lot of other labs can do that. But here's the key. If you get back your soil test report and it says you have so many pounds of nitrate, we get a rain event, it cools down, it warms up, the wind blows, and say it's 2 more weeks or so before you can put the product out. It's going to change. It's going to change in that period of time. So basically, a soil test for nitrogen is a moot point because we know through research how much nitrogen Bermuda grass takes, or fescue, or any of these other flavors of turf grasses. We have a really good feel on that, regardless of what the soil test says. Because, as I said before, it's dynamic. It changes. Now, let me talk about sulfur too. Sulfur is also one of those nutrients that is dynamic. it's available in organic matter. Most of our soils in Tennessee are 2% or less of organic matter. And in each percentage, you get 5 pounds of sulfur, typically. You get about that much nitrogen, too. Another source of sulfur most folks don't know about is acid rain. And it's called atmospheric deposition sulfate. We get in Middle Tennessee around 10, 11, 15 pounds per acre per year of sulfur just through the atmosphere. West Tennessee, it drops off some, but you can still count on about 9 pounds per acre of sulfur per year. Sulfur is one of those too. We do have a soil test, and we've kind of been going through some conversations recently. But it again is not a good indication of how much sulfur your plant has actually taken up. The best way to evaluate if you need sulfur or not is through a tissue analysis on the grass itself. That way you know how much is in the plant, how much it's taking up. If it is deficient, then apply sulfur. But a soil test for sulfur is difficult to do as well. Or it's not difficult, it's easy to do from a lab perspective. It's just not a very good way to reflect how much you need to apply. Okay? Phosphorus. Phosphorus is one of those, it's been touted over the years as the so-called miracle fertilizer. Everybody needs phosphate, you know, that helps good root depth, that sort of thing. It is. It's one of the primary nutrients. But the thing about phosphorus to remember is plants take up very little phosphorus. It is essential. They can't do without it, but they take up very little. In the plant tissue, it's typically only, you know, Dr. Sorokin said something about the nitrogen being 2 to 5%. Phosphate is only 0.2% typically. So it takes up phosphorus, but very little phosphorus. And if you keep continuing to add through 6-12-12, triple 15, starter fertilizers, you have this plan that you do that at a certain time every year, and you don't soil test, you're going to build up that phosphate level. And phosphates are what's running off into the creek, into the groundwater, and it's the one that everybody's concerned about. So watch out for phosphorus. You can build it fairly quickly, fairly easily too. But it is essential. Potassium, it's good for disease resistance and hardiness. You turf folks have known about this for a while. The Haiti people are kind of catching on a little bit. The reason it gets deficient is why? We mow, we take off. We mow, we take off. One of the reasons why was mentioned earlier about putting some of that material back on. One of the reasons you might think about that is get your potassium back. When we cut hay, we take off 8 tons a year on a Bermuda grass field. You're taking off almost 250 pounds of potash a year. Grass is no different. You're cutting it more often. You have to watch out for potassium. That's one of those limiting nutrients we see quite a bit in lawns. Secondary and primary nutrients, calcium, we have no problem with calcium in Tennessee. We're all across the state, we're in good shape. Magnesium, I see a few deficiencies up on the plateau, but they're not related to turf. Sulfur, we've talked about that. And the micronutrients, these are the micronutrients that are needed for most plants. Let me tell you a short word about micronutrients. That's another one we can analyze for. For the most part, we don't see any problems with micronutrients unless you have a highly eroded or weathered soil in Tennessee. There's a lot of companies out pushing these micronutrients that are going to cause these major glamorous improvements in your lawn and your turf, on your golf courses and everything. Pay attention to your pH, phosphorus, and potassium levels first. If those primaries and your pH is in good shape first, I wouldn't even apply a micronutrient unless a tissue analysis says you're deficient. Because just because you put it on the soil, if the plant doesn't need it, guess what? It's just going to be there. And it's going to empty your account. If you don't need it, don't apply it. But validate that with a soil test. I've seen zinc deficiencies on corn where the soil test said it was okay, but the symptoms were saying it looked like a zinc deficiency, and the tissue analysis validated that information, that yes, in fact, it wasn't a zinc deficiency. So try tissue analysis at some point in time if you haven't thought about it. It's a good tool in addition to soil sampling. You know, when to sample, I was thinking on earlier slides, one of the best times to sample would probably be around the World Series, if we're going to put that in the previous perspective. In the time being, you can get a probe in the ground, not as busy at that point in time, and it's the best time, I think, to pull a soil sample. You can sample any time of the year, but when the soil is moist, like I said, I did it last week, and had a few problems where the soil was wet, but for the most part, it was pretty good. Any time of the year and in moist ground, of course. If you try to soil sample in July, it's not much fun. Have a tough time. The key to soil sampling, a good sample, is 6 inches deep. Yep, top through the 6-inch depth. The whole thing. Put a bunch of those cores in a bucket or a sack, mix them together. We need a cup of that mixture. I didn't bring, actually I left it in my car. The soil extraction, what determines your fertilizer requirement, we measure 5 grams of soil. If you took a quarter and heaped up the soil sample on the top of the quarter, about an inch high, that's 5 grams of soil. It's not hardly anything. Some of the other methodologies folks use, it's half of that. Half that amount of soil to determine how much fertilizer you're going to need to apply. So the key is pull a good sample. So you want to go several different areas around that property and pull those samples, mix them together, and then submit that for the testing. Soil test results can be no better than samples submitted. That's a fact. That is an absolute fact. I can guarantee you, us and other people in the soil testing field, we've got our accreditations and we do our job right in the lab. But if you don't pull a good sample out in the field, out in the golf course, wherever it is, we can't make it any better in the lab. You have to get us a good sample. Folks, we get samples in that are 1 core. Yes. 6 inches, 1 core. That is not enough. And I always write down in the database that we got 1 core because those folks usually call me back and say, I don't think your results are correct. I think there's a problem here. And a lot of times for those people, I will tell them, I'll tell you what, if you go pull me a sample the way you're supposed to pull it, a representative sample, I'll be glad to recheck it. And 9 times, well, every time it's different because it's not representative. I've done it myself. It's not correct. And of course, I say 1 cup. It takes nowhere near that much for us to do a soil test. But the thing is, it encourages you to send a good sample. Okay? It encourages you. And I'll tell you too, if you fill that boxer bag up with dry soil, guess what? It's cheaper to ship. I've seen it cost $2 more for a wet sample than a dry sample. And just put it down on a paper plate or a newspaper. Let it dry for a day, crumble it up. It'll save you a lot of money on shipping. Adjusting pH, acidic levels, we've already talked about that. The soil pH for the lime test we do and other labs do requires a buffer value. And this buffer value, well, let me put it this way. Water pH tells us whether or not we need lime. So if your pH is 5.8, you're going to need lime. Okay? The buffer value is done to tell us how much we need lime. So you could technically have 2 samples that are 5.8 and get 2 different lime recommendations. And the buffer value is why that happens. I get a lot of questions about that. And of course, raising the pH, we've got all sorts of flavors of lime. Dolomitic lime, the pelleted, is by far the most popular. It's easy to apply. Use the same rate with pelleted lime as you do regular ag lime. Our recommendations are no different. And adjusting pH, acidic plants need that more. It also increases the solubility of iron as you lower that pH. Here's a good rule of thumb, and this is a very general rule of thumb if you want to write this down. To lower the pH for every 1/10 unit you want to drop, use 0.2 pounds of elemental sulfur per 100 square feet, or 2 pounds of sulfur per 1 unit per 100 square feet. You can move any of those figures around, just move only 2 of them. So if you're talking about 1/10 a unit per 1,000 square feet, you need 20 pounds of sulfur. Okay? And of course, you guys know about all this, the blends of fertilizer, grades, and ratios, and I won't spend no time on that. Soil test results. So you get your report back, and what does all that mean? It was somebody from a turf grass person emailed me a while back, and they had a soil test report, and they needed help reading it. It wasn't from us, it was from somebody else. To this day, I couldn't tell you who it's from, because it didn't say who it was from. It didn't tell you what the method was they used. Didn't even tell you if it was pounds per acre or parts per million. It just had a bunch of numbers on there. They were pretty numbers, and it was a lot of information, but it didn't mean anything because there was no way to interpret it. Didn't have any clue what it was. So my point is, wherever you do your soil analysis, understand there are different methodologies. We use a different method than A&L does. We use a different method than University of Kentucky does. But University of Georgia and Auburn uses the same method we do. So there's all sorts of different methods, and with those different methods are different results. They're not going to be the same, and also the recommendations are not going to be the same because the numbers they pull out of that method are different. Now, pH is different. Most of us use the same method, and that's the water pH. So you can usually go with the same there. But those other ones, I would follow the recommendations that come from that methodology. And you need to know whether their interpret is high, low, optimum. Some labs, I've seen them report levels and not tell you what that means. You need to know what that means. And then, of course, the results and recommendations should be, and this is my personal opinion, non-biased and based on research, university research. If they are based on anything else, it's your money you're spending. But the thing about our university recommendations are this. When we put those recommendations out there, it's not an arbitrary figure. It's based on performance, and it's also, before any of the recommendations go into my database at the lab, they go to an economist. And the economist decides at what level do we hit that point of diminishing returns. And then we go back and we look at our recommendations again. So my point is, there's a lot of information out there, but be sure you understand what that is. So this is one of our reports. Now I'm going to tell you, I know a lot of you folks probably don't need all this verbiage in here, but we have a lot of homeowners that I'm sure you deal with sometimes who have no clue what they're doing. That's why they probably have you hired to do the work for them. But on this case, we have a low pH of 5.6. We start recommending lime at a 6.0, by the way. Buffer value of 7.6. The average in Tennessee is about a 7.6. That's about right. Low phosphorus, low potassium. We don't see this much. Usually it's new ground, or what I say is new ground, where somebody's built a house, they sold off the topsoil and brought in subsoil and filled it around the house, and it's not pretty. It takes years to get that back up. But this is a soil test. Calcium 1748, that's fairly normal for Tennessee, and 268 magnesium. These are fairly regular in Tennessee. We don't get deficient calcium until we're down around 500. We don't get deficient magnesium until we're down in the 60s or so. So we're good there. And our recommendation is 100 pounds of lime, and then there's 6, 12, 12, and all sorts of things in there in that recommendation. This is for homeowners. Here's another one. This is very typical too, especially in the metropolitan cities. We find that homeowners are either over-fertilized and underlime or are over lime and under fertilized, one or the other. Here's one of very bad pH, 5.074, very high on phosphorus, high on potassium. We don't recommend any further phosphorus and potassium at a higher, very high soil test. Now, I can tell you some of these flavors have a 3 and a 4, but you're not really adding much percentage there. But we back off of the 6, 12, 12 and the triple 15s and that sort of thing at a very high or high soil test. If we look at another one here, look at this phosphorus. 2,362 pounds per acre. I've seen them 8,000 pounds per acre in some of the yards and gardens and so forth. Now, in Middle, and this is, let's see, I can't remember what county this is, I've cut it off, but in Middle Tennessee, we do have high phosphate soils naturally, but they're typically not that high. That's over fertilization, and potassium is over fertilized. But in this case, all we recommend is nitrogen. That's it, no phosphate or potash. So what are we seeing? And this, I promise, this is the only chart I'm going to show you, but what I did is I went through our database and pulled out data. This is from soil samples received from January 2010 through December this past year. L is cool season lawns, LB is warm season lawns. That's our crop code. So statewide, and these are in terms of percentages, you can see better than half are okay on pH. 6.1, above 6.1, we don't recommend lime. Phosphorus, it's anybody's bet. In most cases, we're good on phosphorus. And potassium, we're pretty good on that too, better than half or higher, very high on potash. West Tennessee, though, I pulled those out, and it's anybody's guess, but most of them seem a little bit lower in pH. Okay? Phosphorus, we're a little bit on the high side, as a general rule. And I thought this was interesting. Look at potassium. The majority of them are in the high range. So what to gather from this is if you don't soil test and you apply fertilizer, you might be wasting your money. If you do soil test and you follow the soil test, you're going to optimize your production, optimize what you have. Okay? Because you're going to know what you're doing. So soil analysis is just part of the big picture, right? You have to worry about all these other things. I was thinking a few minutes ago while I was listening to some of the other presentations, y'all have a lot on your hands. You have a lot to keep up with, something to do every month of the year. There's a lot of you running up and down the road. And what better tool, though, to take care of a lot of those things if you have any questions come up? You have the soil test. One of the things I will say, though, as an industry, and I've been doing this over 20 years, in the past 10 years, I see more and more of you folks coming into our doors. I think that's a good thing. I think that's a great thing. And I think it speaks a lot for your industry. I think it speaks a lot, too, for those folks who are interested in runoff and all those sorts of things. And those of you that go to these sorts of meetings or so forth, you're the ones that are already doing these things. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I hope maybe you learn a few things, even if you don't use our laboratory. Whatever laboratory it is you use, understand those results. One more thing before I stop, too, that I just want you to know that, and I see this as samples come in. When you send a soil sample in, a lot of times we keep information in our database for your company. But if you have a client that you have year after year after year, by the way, we only recommend a soil test every 3 or 4 years. We don't recommend one every year. Soils are not that dynamic with regard to the things we test for. Now, nitrogen changes and that sulfur and that sort of thing, but all those others are not that dynamic. But when you pull the soil sample for a client, put the year somewhere in the sample ID. Because that way you can go back over time and with your client, if you need to, you have that relevant information. You pulled that sample this time of year and this is what it was. We have, I know for a fact, we have some turf grass managers in Middle Tennessee that are, I've seen them out applying fertilizer in January, late January with the truck. It's not good. And I know for a fact there's people out applying chemicals that for problems they may have caused by over-fertilizing or too much nitrogen or not putting down the chemical at the right time of the year or something. So, but those are folks that aren't coming to these meetings, folks that aren't soil testing, folks that aren't doing the right thing. If you need us, call us. We are, like Alan said, on Facebook. If you're ever in Nashville, anytime around Ellington Agricultural Center, that's where we are, come by and see me. I'd love to give you a tour of our lab. We're not the same place we were 10 years ago. We're not the same place we were 5 years ago. Our instrumentation, everything has been totally upgraded where we have the most updated technology. I'm proud of it. Come by and see us. I'd love to take you on a tour. Thanks a lot.